The Canadian. It's Canada's most iconic rail journey and the second longest in the world, and the only passenger route in Canada that goes from Vancouver to Toronto. Join me as I embark on a journey through time and tradition aboard the Silver Bullet, from exploring the majestic mountain landscapes to the Canadian cities shaped by the Canadian railways, from dining in the dining car to the elegant Grand Railway hotels built over a century ago that those same dining cars were named after. This is the Canadian, and this sets the stage for my unforgettable adventure by rail across Canada, or at least part of it.
Onboard!
The Canadian is easily one of, if not the most famous trains in the entire world. Brought in by Canadian Pacific in 1955, this stainless steel streamliner has seen over 75 years worth of riding the rails through the Rockies, across the prairies, and along the Great Lakes and into Canada's two biggest cities in downtown Toronto and downtown Montreal. Now, although this stainless steel beauty has changed quite a bit over the years, this is going to be my 10th time on the Canadian. And spoiler alert, taking the train across Canada is my favorite way to travel. It's just a shame it's not more accessible, but we can discuss that later on. But a constant since its debut in 1955 is the Grand Railway hotels that have served its major stops along the way. And I'm actually in the midst of a series across Canada documenting the history, stories, and experiences at those same Grand Railway hotels today in 2024. And I just spent one night in Vancouver at the Hotel Vancouver, better known as the Castle in the city, and it truly was an experience of luxury fit for a king. And 3 kilometers to the east of that hotel lies Pacific Central Station, my portal today from Vancouver back to Winnipeg, which will take us to our next Grand Railway hotel stop at the Fort Garry Hotel. But here at Pacific Central Station, it was built in 1919 by the Canadian Northern Railway, and Pacific Central would operate under Canadian National's ownership from 1920 until 1978, when all Canadian passenger rail service was put off by CN and CP to a new government-run Crown Corporation we know today as Via Rail. And 40 years ago, this station saw daily departures in east and westbound directions along the Southern Canadian Pacific route to Banff, Calgary, Winnipeg, Thunder Bay, and arriving in downtown Montreal, as well as the northern route to the Rockies and Jasper, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and downtown Toronto. But today only sees 2 departures a week out of Pacific Central here in Vancouver. But that doesn't mean today's version of the Canadian will disappoint. As a matter of fact, I think it gets better every single time you ride it, which I'll share more on later. So the Canadian leaves the edge of downtown Vancouver, heading east into Burnaby. And this is going to be the first of many crossings over the Fraser River on this trip, as it flows from Vancouver almost into Jasper in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, where we will end up tomorrow afternoon. Now, this is the same route the Canadian has taken since 1955, heading east from Vancouver to Kamloops later tonight. But that is where we will split north and head towards Jasper instead of staying east towards Revelstoke, Banff, and Calgary like the original Canadian Pacific Canadian did from 1955 until 1990. But when we wake up tomorrow morning, we're only going to be a few hours outside of Jasper. When we woke up this morning, we were greeted with a beautiful fresh blanket of snow over the Canadian Rockies. And I mean, we were actually rolling through a winter wonderland like in the Polar Express. And I'm all for it. Now, as the weather began to clear up closer towards Valemount, BC, we started trekking towards the peak of the Canadian Rockies, and that is Mount Robson, named after this guy, Colin Robertson, who 100% got bullied as a kid. This is the tallest peak in the Canadian Rockies at almost 4,000 meters high. And believe it or not, this entire route was laid by Grand Trunk Pacific Railway at the dawn of the 20th century to compete with Canadian Pacific. And although Grand Trunk went bankrupt and got absorbed into Canadian National Railways in 1923, Grand Trunk had broke ground on the Chateau Mount Robson, which was a chateau-style hotel designed to compete with the Canadian Pacific's Chateau Lake Louise in Banff National Park, and it looked something like this, at least conceptually. And considering how well built everything Grand Trunk made was, it really makes me wonder what could have been here in the valley of Mount Robson if they hadn't gone bankrupt, but we'll never know. And about an hour after Mount Robson, we would arrive into Jasper, a town with a population of about 4,000 people, often hailed as Banff of the North. Jasper, Alberta blends breathtaking landscapes with a less commercialized charm, setting it apart from the southern counterpart in Banff and Lake Louise. At the end of the 19th century, Grand Trunk Pacific wanted to establish a Rocky Mountain settlement for its route west to Prince Rupert on the Pacific. Initially, Jasper was just a camp for railway workers tracing the North Saskatchewan and Skeena rivers west towards the Pacific, but in 1911, Grand Trunk selected Jasper as its divisional hub. Jasper's economy flourished, and the doors would swing open wide to an influx of tourists eager to experience the untouched beauty of the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And I believe this stands as a testament to all humans' intrinsic love for nature, the great outdoors, and the Rocky Mountains, myself included. And as we reboarded the Canadian and headed back east out of Jasper towards Henry House, and as the valleys began to widen and the mountain peaks came to a head, I headed down to the dining car for the first call for dinner. And the second night east is my favorite meal on the Canadian because it's prime rib night. I mean, who does not love prime rib? Now, all the other meals on the train are absolutely outstanding, from breakfast to lunch to dinner, and they serve it all in these dining cars that have been around since 1955 and were named after some of Canada's finest Grand Railway hotels, including this, the Palliser dining car, named after the Palliser Hotel in Calgary. And although yes, the fireplace at the Palliser Hotel in Calgary is special, and yes, the oval room at the Fort Garry is iconic, and Notch 8 at the Hotel Vancouver, which actually has a really cool tie into the railway if you missed last week's episode, all of them are cool, but the Canadian is my favorite restaurant in the entire world. It's a place where the environment and the views are constantly changing, the meals are always outstanding, and the grandeur of 1955 is still alive and well. And shortly after the last black coffees were poured to complement the dessert pairings for this evening, we would arrive into Canada's most northern major city, Edmonton. And Edmonton's pasture landscape has changed a lot over the decades. Now, as we arrive, you'll see the downtown skyline in the distance, but once upon a time, the Canadian arrived in the heart of that downtown skyline. It was 1963, and the Canadian National Railway had just demolished their passenger station in Edmonton to make way for a tower that would symbolize the ambition aimed to inject excitement into Canadian passenger rail service. And this tower was destined to be Edmonton's new hub for long-distance rail service into downtown en route from the Rockies and Jasper. But only 15 years later, in 1978, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific handed off all passenger service to the Canadian government in today's format of Via Rail, and only 3 years later, in 1981, not a lot of people know this, the government would cut service to Edmonton in favor of service to Calgary and Banff, until 1985, when a new Canadian government would come in, reverse it and restore Edmonton service, and then in 1990 would cut service to Calgary and Banff forever, and only 8 years later in 1998, passenger service was yanked out of downtown Edmonton in favor of today's station, which, let's be honest, it's barely a station by Grand Trunk and Canadian Pacific standards, as it lies on the outskirts of the city and resembles more of a bus shack than a train station, fit for one of the world's most iconic passenger trains. And this marked the end of passenger service in the heart of Edmonton, and also passengers getting off at the CN Tower and staying in the city's Grand Railway Hotel down the street at the Hotel McDonald, which will be a dedicated video in this series on the Grand Railway Hotels of Canada, so stay tuned for that. But after a 3-hour stop outside of Edmonton, we were on our way heading towards Saskatoon, where we will arrive tomorrow morning. Welcome to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan's biggest city with a population of 250,000. Now, the station behind me was completed in 1966, and a lot like last night in Edmonton, passenger service was moved out of downtown Saskatoon in favor of today's station, which is seemingly situated in the middle of nowhere, just under 10 kilometers away from Saskatoon's Grand Railway Hotel, also known as the Castle on the River at the Bessborough Hotel, which, don't worry, that will be a dedicated video in this Railway Hotel series coming up. The Bessborough has not seen a passenger train outside the original downtown station in almost 65 years. And as I reboard the Canadian, leaving the Saskatoon yards behind us, crossing over the North Saskatchewan River, and roaring through the fields of Saskatchewan for the rest of the morning and afternoon before a quick pit stop in the Melville, I made this video on the Canadian and my current series in the Grand Railway Hotels of Canada because I'm really hoping for a rail renaissance in Canada soon. Because taking the train across Canada is a seductive experience. It's relaxing, it's sexy, and even though it may not match the speed of flying or driving, the allure of the train is absolutely undeniable. And as we trek through the Qu'appelle Valley, we will cross over the Trestle Bridge, and it's the final landmark on this trip before my arrival later tonight. Built in 1907, it was originally a woodpile trestle, but a tornado in September of 1915 struck the bridge, knocking it completely over, and shortly after, a freight engineer would cross the bridge to his death in the valley below. Now, this was Grand Trunk's main line, and 3 weeks later they had completely rebuilt the bridge, which was an absolute engineering marvel of the time. And in 1929 they would swap the wood for steel, which still stands to this day. And now a quick word from today's video sponsor, Manscaped.com. The team at Manscaped has introduced their brand new Lawnmower 5 for 2024 for all your below-the-belt grooming, and coupled with their Beard Hedger will get you absolutely dialed in this season for a glow-up like never before. I use the Beard Hedger's 20 trim lengths, 60-minute battery life, and waterproof design every week to taper and fade my beard in between appointments with my barber, and my Lawnmower 5.0 keeps me prepared to perform for all my date nights, and you can too when you use the code TRAVSUCKS20 for 20% off and free shipping when you click on that first link in the video description, only at manscaped.com. And thank you again, Manscaped, for sponsoring this video. As we trek out of the Qu'appelle Valley and into Manitoba and into my birthplace and final destination of Winnipeg later tonight, I hope that the charm of train travel becomes as apparent in this video to you as it is to me. From sitting in the parked car at the back of the consist, sipping on a hot cup of coffee, to the sounds of the prairies rumbling by, or sitting up in the dome car watching the world go by, to the sleeping accommodations in my berth, which by the way was a lot more comfy than you would think. It's easily the best configuration, and if you've ever experienced a culinary service on the Canadian, you'll understand why it's my favorite restaurant in the world. Because on the Canadian, it's all aboard for an adventure where the history of Canada's past continues to captivate the imaginations and the inner child in all of us, myself included. And speaking of which, although the Canadian does go for another 2 days east into Toronto, here outside Winnipeg Union Station and across the street from the iconic passenger train is the Fort Garry, one of the 2 Grand Railway hotels built in Winnipeg, as the focus of next week's video. And I cannot wait to share that story and my experience of this former Grand Trunk icon that has stood for over 110 years. This Vancouver to Winnipeg trip is just one small video in a series that I'm doing across Canada, staying at as many of the Grand Railway hotels as I possibly can, from the Hotel Vancouver to the Fort Garry Hotel that you saw in this video, to the Hotel McDonald in Edmonton, Banff Springs in Banff, and the Best Borough in Saskatoon, and more. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a single one of those videos. Thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see you in next week's video and share my next stop in this series at the Fort Garry. I'll see you then.